freedom arrived without an address. A mother could be legally free in Tennessee while her child lived hundreds of miles away in Texas under another surname. A husband might know only that his wife had been sold south 20 years earlier. Brothers and sisters could remember a first name, an old plantation, a scar, a song, or the sound of a childhood nickname, yet have no official document proving they had ever belonged to one another. The auction block had disappeared, but it left no map back home. When slavery ended in the United States, freedom did not automatically reunite the families slavery had torn apart. Nearly 4 million black people emerged from bondage, but countless parents, children, spouses, and siblings remained scattered across a country transformed by war. Some had been sold across state lines, others had escaped, followed Union armies, entered refugee camps, or been carried away by enslavers fleeing the collapse of the Confederacy. Many did not know whether the people they loved were alive, so they began to search. They walked roads that had once been closed to them. They questioned soldiers, boatmen, railroad workers, ministers, teachers, market vendors, and strangers arriving from distant counties. Letters moved between churches and military posts. Newspaper notices crossed state borders. Rumors traveled through kitchens, fields, docks, train stations, and black communities that were forming in the ruins of slavery. This was not a small side effect of emancipation. For many formerly enslaved people, finding family was one of freedom's most urgent purposes. Under slavery, family bonds had enormous emotional meaning, but almost no legal protection. Enslaved marriages were generally not recognized by law, and the legal status of a child followed the mother, allowing enslavers to claim children as property from birth. A sale caused by debt, inheritance, punishment, relocation, or profit could separate a household with little warning. A child might be taken to a nearby farm or transported hundreds of miles into the expanding cotton and sugar regions of the Deep South. The domestic slave trade made that distance especially brutal. During the decades before the Civil War, large numbers of enslaved people were forced from the Upper South into states such as Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. Traders changed routes, buyers changed names, and families lost track of one another as people passed through jails, auction houses, pens, boats, and overland chains. Yet separation did not erase memory. Parents taught children the names of grandparents they might never meet. Adults remembered the county where they were born, the name of an enslaver, the bend of a river, or the church near an old plantation. A person sold as a child might preserve only a few fragments, but those fragments became coordinates for a future search. Even before the war ended, some enslaved people risked escape, partly to reach relatives. Historian Abigail Cooper has shown how kinship shaped movement through Civil War refugee camps, the improvised settlements that grew around Union lines as enslaved people freed themselves. One striking story is that of Mary Armstrong, who later recalled setting out as a young woman to find her mother. Acting on news that her family might be in Texas, she traveled an extraordinary distance during the chaos of war, carrying supplies and following information passed from person to person. Her journey reveals something maps cannot show. Freedom moved through human networks before it moved through stable institutions. One traveler heard a surname at a landing. A soldier recognized the name of a plantation. A woman in a refugee camp remembered a family taken west. Each clue could send someone toward another town, another office, or another uncertain road. After the Confederacy collapsed, federal agencies became possible places to ask for help. Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands in March 1865. Usually called the Freedmen's Bureau, it distributed aid, supported schools, supervised labor arrangements, recorded marriages, and handled complaints across much of the former Confederacy. Families approached Bureau agents with questions the government had never been designed to answer. Where had a daughter been sold? Did a former enslaver know the location of a husband? Could an agent write to another district? Was a child living with relatives an employer, or the person who had once claimed ownership? The Bureau's surviving records contain names, marriages, labor contracts, hospital entries, complaints, transportation requests, and correspondence. Taken together, they offer glimpses of people trying to reconstruct family life. However, the system was temporary, uneven, underfunded, and often hostile or indifferent at the local level. An agent might record a useful clue, dismiss the request, misspell a name, or leave no trace of the conversation at all. Official paperwork could help, but it could not repair a society that had deliberately kept family connections legally weak and poorly documented. Black churches often became more reliable centers of information. Their congregations linked rural communities, growing towns, migration routes, schools, and aid societies. Ministers traveled. Members visited relatives in other counties. Church conferences brought together people from wide areas, creating opportunities to exchange names and stories. A search notice read aloud from a pulpit could reach listeners who never saw a newspaper. One congregation might send the information to another. A preacher traveling to a regional meeting could carry the names farther. In this way, the church functioned as a living communications network built from trust memory and repeated contact. The black press extended that network across even greater distances. Newspapers such as the Christian Recorder and the Southwestern Christian Advocate printed notices under headings like Information Wanted and Lost Friends. These advertisements were usually brief, but every line carried a lifetime of loss. A searcher listed the names of parents, children, brothers, sisters, or spouses, the place where they had last lived, the enslaver connected to them, and the direction in which someone had been taken. The wording could appear restrained because the notice had to be useful. Emotion was compressed into identifying details. A mother named Nancy, a sister called Alice, sold at Jackson, Mississippi, last heard from before the war. Behind such lines stood decades of unanswered questions. Historian Heather Andrea Williams, in her study Help Me to Find My People, used letters, advertisements, interviews, public records, and personal narratives to reconstruct these searches. Her work demonstrates that emancipation did not close the history of family separation. It opened a new chapter in which formerly enslaved people tried to reverse the forced movement imposed upon them. The advertisements also exposed the strange geography of memory. Searchers often identified relatives through the names of enslavers because slavery had denied them dependable access to surnames and records of their own. One person might have used several surnames over a lifetime. Another was remembered only by a first name, an occupation, a physical feature, or a relationship to someone else. Locations changed just as easily. County boundaries shifted. Plantations were renamed. Former enslavers died, moved, or divided property among heirs. A clue accurate in 1855 might be nearly useless in 1885. Still, people kept writing. The Southwestern Christian Advocate, published in New Orleans and distributed through a broad church network, became one of the most important places for these appeals. Its Lost Friends notices appeared long after the Civil War, proving that hope did not follow a convenient historical schedule. Some searchers were elderly by the time they could pay for an advertisement or find someone able to write it. In 1892, Caroline Flowers placed a notice asking for information about her people. She was around 60 years old and named 9 siblings from whom she had been separated. The list was not merely genealogical. It was a family gathering assembled in print because it could not yet happen in a room. Other notices asked ministers to read the appeal publicly. Jane Moultrie sought help from churches in Atlanta in finding her mother and siblings. Harriet Williams searched for a daughter named Mary, separated from her when the child was about 4 years old. A.J. Simpson continued looking for his sister Sarah Ann after losing her when he was a boy. Each person understood that the advertisement itself could not travel everywhere. Readers had to carry it. A subscriber might recognize an old place name, clip the notice, write a letter, tell a neighbor, or pass the paper to a minister. Someone who could not read might hear the words aloud and remember a person matching the description. The search therefore moved through both print and speech, combining literacy with oral knowledge. Learning to read and write gained a deeply personal urgency after emancipation. Education offered protection in labor contracts and civic life, but it also allowed family members to communicate across distance without depending entirely on white intermediaries. A letter could carry questions no traveler had time to ask. It could preserve names accurately, at least when the writer knew how they were spelled. Even so, many searchers dictated their words to ministers, teachers, editors, or literate relatives. The person holding the pen was not always the person whose hope filled the page. Some searches produced reunions. News might arrive that a relative lived in the next county, another state, or a city reached by rail. A journey followed, sometimes after decades apart. Recognition could come through a remembered story, a childhood event, a family name, or a physical resemblance. These moments were powerful, precisely because the odds had been so poor. Yet reunion was not simple. A husband or wife presumed dead might have remarried. Children taken young could remember little of their birth families. Parents had aged beyond recognition. New households formed during separation, creating obligations and attachments that could not be erased. Freedom allowed people to rebuild families, but it could also bring two different versions of the past into the same room. Many searches ended without an answer. Silence could mean death. Migration, a changed name, a lost letter, an unread newspaper, or a clue that arrived too late. The absence of a reply did not reveal which possibility was true. That uncertainty became its own form of grief. Judith Giesberg and the research team behind the Last Seen project have recovered thousands of advertisements placed by people searching for relatives and friends after slavery. The archive includes notices published from the 19th century into the early 20th century, showing how the search continued across generations. Its scale is haunting, but the individual details resist becoming statistics. One notice may contain only a few sentences. Those sentences can preserve a mother's name that appears nowhere else. The Historic New Orleans Collection's Lost Friends database performs similar work with advertisements from the Southwestern Christian Advocate. Together with the Freedmen's Bureau records preserved by the National Archives and made searchable through institutions such as the National Museum of African American History and Culture, these collections allow descendants to follow trails that once seemed permanently broken. That is the modern echo of the 19th century search. Today, a person may type a name into a digital archive instead of mailing a letter to a newspaper. Church networks have been joined by genealogy forums, census databases, digitized newspapers, family trees, and DNA research. The tools have changed, but the basic method remains familiar. Gather every surviving name, place, relationship, story, and fragment. Share the information widely. Wait for another person to recognize it. Modern technology can connect records across enormous distances, yet it cannot replace what slavery destroyed. Some documents were never created. Others recorded enslaved people only as ages, sexes, prices, or numbers. Names were misspelled, changed, or deliberately omitted. Success, therefore, depends on cautious interpretation rather than the illusion of a complete archive. Historical understanding also continues to evolve. Scholars working with advertisements, bureau documents, family testimony, and newly digitized collections regularly uncover connections that earlier generations could not see. Their conclusions must remain open to revision because every recovered notice can alter a family history, and every silence in the record may conceal a story rather than prove that none existed. The search itself tells us something slavery failed to destroy. Enslavers treated family ties as obstacles to profit and control. Formerly enslaved people treated those same ties as obligations worth years of travel money, writing prayer and uncertainty. They searched not because reunion was likely, but because claiming a mother, child, spouse, sibling, or grandparent was part of claiming a life beyond property. Freedom arrived without an address. Black families spent generations writing one.